And I almost think that we should get on to Pat, actually, because this fits so much with... Are you still okay for this? And the reason I mention that is that some of the papers that I carry around most of the time... here's one, Ronnie, that's Klaus-Peter Lesch, The Long Short Story, The Serotonin Transporter in Emotion Regulation, Social Cognition. So this is a paper that was in Nature Neuroscience in September, this is the one that Rodolfo Lina says was rubbish?
Yeah, well, he didn't know the paper itself. It's my awkward description routine.
Okay. So if you are actually doing readings, and these are harder to read than some of the other things, but in Nature Neuroscience for September 2007, there's a paper by Klaus-Peter Lesch called The Long Short Story about the serotonin transporter gene, which I highly recommend. And there's also a paper here that we have called Damage to the Prefrontal Cortex Increases Utilitarian Moral Judgments, which we may or may not believe, but it's the sort of thing that Pat will probably talk about. Pat is UC President's Professor of Philosophy at UC San Diego, recently gave up being chair of the department, and she co-founded with Paul this wonderful field of neurophilosophy, and her latest book was Brainwise, which is widely available. Pat Churrchland.
Thank you so much. It's always really tough to follow Ronnie D'Souza, especially when everybody's really hungry. But Ronnie, many of you will have rightly guessed, had also a theatrical career. And I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint Stuart Kaufman because I can't say anything about things spiritual. It's just not in my temperament. And it's also really not in my temperament I mean, I can enjoy poetry, and I just admire Ronnie so much to be able to stand up and read a poem in front of people. I mean, I'm actually kind of embarrassed to read one to myself, but there you go. Oh, and I can't sing. But I actually agree about dancing, but we'll get on to that. All right. There's two, roughly speaking, domains in neuroethics. One has to do with applications of recent discoveries to the nervous system in various ways, certain kinds of interventions. I'm not so interested in that. What I am interested in is the second thing, and that is ethics itself as a biological and cultural phenomenon. But as I'm particularly interested in the brain, what I'm most curious about is what is it that we can understand from the point of view of neuroscience that might help us to understand how it is that brains make it possible for people to do things that are seemingly not in their own interest. So a number of topics are of great interest to me here. One concerns the neurobiological nature of decisions and choices. And interestingly enough, that is a domain to which neuroscientists can now begin to make progress. And you can actually record from single cells in various parts of the cortex as a decision-making task is undertaken. I also want to understand the neurobiological nature of moral motivation, and finally something about the nature of self-representation and self-control. The topic that I'm going to focus on here has to do with moral motivation, and on other occasions I can talk about the other things. It's been known, of course, by naturalists and biologists for a long time that many, many kinds of animals are social. Here we see ants cooperating to build a shelter. Many people have understood quite well the dynamics of social behavior in wolves where, and I think this is where it begins to get really interesting, only the dominant pair are the breeding pair. The others are quite capable of breeding, but in actual fact do not, though they will take part in the hunt and so forth. This has always suggested to people that there must be a neurobiological account of the nature of social behavior. Now, although molecular biologists and evolutionary biologists understood quite well that we should be able to link something about the nature of genes to cooperative and sharing and mutually defending behavior, what we really need to understand is the role of the brain in all of that. How is it? Because the brain is the thing that is between the genes and the behavior. Now, all of this changed quite recently, and some of you know this story already. If you don't, I think it's, if I may sort of paraphrase Peter Atkins this morning, knowing the story of the voles, not knowing the story of the voles is sort of like not knowing who the Beatles are. But in any case, the story broke, actually it broke with an observation, a very casual observation about the nematode C. elegans that only has about 1,000 neurons. And the observation was that under conditions of food scarcity, you see two very different kinds of behavior amongst C. elegans. Some tend to cluster together and some move apart. And it was discovered that the main difference between those two and how they behave under these conditions has to do with oxytocin. Well, that immediately caused consternation because oxytocin had been well known for its role in other parts of the body. In females, in mammals, for example, and it was well known in the case of humans, it's involved in parturition and in lactation. And so people began to wonder if there might be something special about this particular peptide in social bonding. And in fact, this picked up on something that Paul MacLean, who Ronnie also mentioned, something Paul MacLean had said, but that actually Darwin had said before, which was something about the social behavior of mammals might be traceable to the parent-offspring connection, and that it's the broadening and expanding of that connection to wider members of the group that constitutes an important development in social behavior. Now, the story of the voles, I'll just go through quickly because I did this also last year. But the story of the voles, for those of you who don't know, goes roughly like this. There's many species of voles, and they're in particular prairie voles and montane voles. One behavior that distinguishes them is that prairie voles are monogamous pair bonders. After the first mating, they bond for life. Montane voles are promiscuous pair bonders. There are some other differences pertaining to rearing of pups, which is a much more cooperative enterprise for prairie voles. In montane voles, it largely falls to the females. So one question was, what might be the difference between the brains of prairie voles and montane voles to sustain this really quite interesting behavior? Now, monogamous pair bonding had been seen in the biological domain in other species. In birds, for example, it's quite well known that Canada geese tend to mate for life, but it's also known in other mammals. Now, the idea that oxytocin might play a role here occurred to a number of people at about the same time, partly because they were intrigued by the social bond between mother and child, and the realization through rat studies that if you take a female rat who has not had babies, is not in estrus, nothing of that kind, and you inject oxytocin into her brain, what she will do is go to a neighboring female who does have pups, and she'll begin to make a nest, take those pups, and behave for all the world as though she had had pups. So the question was then, what might be the difference between prairie voles and montane voles, and I'll get quickly to the answer. And it depends on males, differences between males and females, so let me just say what in a very short story was the difference. In males, there are receptors for a peptide that's very similar to oxytocin called vasopressin. And what distinguishes between the monogamous pair bonders and the promiscuous pair bonders is the density of receptors in a very particular part of the brain. And that's shown in this slide. And in females, what distinguishes the monogamous pair bonders from those who aren't is the density of receptors for oxytocin in a very specific part of the brain. So the male prairie voles have a very high density of receptors. The montane voles don't. Is this just a correlation, or might it be causal? Scientists investigating this did all of the obvious manipulations. In the prairie voles, you block the receptors, and the little rascals become promiscuous. Now, you have to do the other kind of manipulation in mice, that is, to increase the density of receptors in the male, but you can turn a promiscuous mouse into a monogamous pair bonder. Now, it isn't just that they pair bond, but they also protect the nest. They will fight intruders. They will fight others who come along and appear to be interested. The molecular biology revealed that the determining factor had to do with a promoter, shown here as a bit of microsatellite DNA, which is responsible for turning on a particular part of DNA that produces the protein, which is the receptor for vasopressin, and roughly the same in the case of oxytocin. Now, when I first encountered the story, I was really very interested because it seemed to reflect the Darwinian hypothesis that you might have very particular kinds of behavior having to do with cooperation and selflessness in the context of the family, and that might be spread to a wider domain. And people then who looked at the behavior of various primates found that there were certain very interesting differences in the case of primate behavior as a function of whether the males were related to one another or whether the females were related to one another. So the particular case I want to draw to your attention has to do with intertribal conflict, or between group conflict. In the case of chimpanzees, the males largely stay within the troop and the females leave. And as you will know, the recent literature on this is quite extensive, but chimpanzee troops are lethal. And they will attack other troops and one by one kill them off, and often kill them off in the most brutal fashion. Some other primates, where it's the males who leave and you have a female hierarchy, do actually behave somewhat differently. That is, they tend not to have lethal intergroup competition. So certainly one of the questions that this raises in the context of wondering how we get beyond just the family unit to the wider group, and in the human case, how we get from those that we're not immediately related to those that are in the wider group but with whom we share no genes. Very interesting questions can now be raised in a way that they weren't really raisable before. So the one issue then, before I do that, let me just remark here as a kind of summary that it does appear that in a certain way evolution sets the brain's style of drives and emotions, not just in the case of social emotions, but the drives and desires to get food, to seek shelter, to avoid a fight, or to engage a fight, and so forth. And then comes the story of the reward system. And again, neuroscience within the last 15 years has begun to plumb the details of how the reward system works in mammals. Really important breakthroughs were made by Wolfram Schultz, but Terry's lab here at the Salk also works on the reward system. So to a first approximation, apart from humans, what it does look like is that we share much because it's in our genetic interest to share and to cooperate and to live within groups, but that's all underwritten by very basic neurobiology, and that the specifics of convention, using this convention as opposed to that convention, comes into being as a result of the way the reward system is tuned up. And so one group might settle a difference in one way, and another group in another way, simply as a result of conventions. So, but the question does remain, and this is one that many evolutionary biologists have worked on for a long time: what does explain human-style altruism? And I think one of the things that I found so interesting about Greg Clark's talk yesterday is the reminder that human-style altruism can change over time. That is, from the not just as a result of culture, but possibly even as a result of natural selection. So it's not exactly clear what human-style altruism is. And sometimes I think our intuitions about human-style altruism can really be quite wrong. In our culture, if you raise an issue about infanticide, people are most likely to rear back in absolute horror. They have a visceral reaction to it. But as I'm sure Scott Atran could tell you, even in certain cultures now, but certainly in cultures in the past, infanticide was really a fairly standard way of dealing with certain very difficult problems. And it was not considered, under certain circumstances, to be a truly dreadful thing. The case of the Inuit is extremely well known, so I won't go into detail, but it is known that because they lived on the very knife edge of survival, where having a group that was too large or too large to bring in the energy resources that were necessary to keep it going, they let the females die. Not an unreasonable thing. But for most of us who live in a culture of great prosperity, this, of course, doesn't seem quite right. Now, Sam Bowles and others have argued with regard to human-style altruism within the group and the idea that the group can expand beyond immediate kin, that lethal group intergroup competition might actually have been an important factor in this. And part of his argument is that groups may have realized that if they could join together, that then they could take on another group and share the resources that they pillaged. Now, part of the difficulty with that has always been, so how do you allow people into the group? Because allowing them in, of course, could be a very dangerous thing. And one hypothesis that occurred to me came about, it actually occurred to me in a very odd way. I was interested in something completely different as a result of a meeting Terry was organizing. This had to do with unconscious mimicry. I thought, well, what is unconscious mimicry all about? The psychological literature on it is quite vast and very detailed and very respectable, but I'll just sum it up for you very briefly. The basic point is this. If you have a student and a Confederate, the Confederate is told to mimic in no way any of the mannerisms, the eye movements, the smiles, whatever, of the student. And then they're given a task on which they work. At the end, the student is debriefed. How did you feel about, so-and-so? If there is no imitation, by and large, the students find the Confederate creepy. I don't know, I just felt really uncomfortable. He didn't do anything, but, it just, I hate to say this, but there's something wrong with that guy. On the other hand, if there was a lot of imitation, they really liked them. They felt they were in sync, that there was a way that they were cooperating that was kind of special and unique. And sort of as long as you weren't sort of overtly mocking the other person, but just kind of, looking this way when they looked that way and so forth, it turned out to work very well. And there were many related studies showing that if a person is really anxious about their social status, they will, unbeknownst to themselves, imitate to a much higher degree than they normally do in social interactions. So what does this have to do with beginning to explain how the group can expand beyond kin? I think that it's quite, the reason why I asked myself this question was, well, what good is all of this unconscious mimicry? Why do we do it so much? And of course, you're using quite a lot of energy in doing it. And the answer the psychologists give is that it increases social facility and so forth. But what I want to know is, why is that a good thing? I mean, why do brains care about this? And believe me, you do it. I didn't really think I engaged in it until I watched myself in novel social situations and found out, you know, this person goes like this, I go like this. They smile, I smile. Very interesting. One thought goes as follows, that in the small unit, in the parent-offspring unit, imitation by the offspring is extremely important. Now, we know that humans imitate to a much greater degree, or so we think anyhow, than many other animals. And we like it, and you know, it helps them learn. But there's something else that's going on, and that is that in the very early stages, it isn't just that the child is learning something and getting it by imitation instead of by trial and error, which is a lot cheaper. It's that child's ability to imitate, to smile when you smile, long about 3 months old, right? To point when you point, and so forth, is the best indication you have of the normality of that child's social brain. If its social brain is, to use a scientific term, run amok, then it will not be able to engage in that kind of imitative behavior. And that's the best signal that a parent has that something is wrong. And I think the same is true at the larger level. When, for example, new people wish to enter the group, the very best first pass filter you've got is how they behave in this imitative fashion. And part of the reason I think that's true is anecdotal. But there's other data as well. The anecdotal part of the story goes like this, that when I was growing up, this was a very, very small village. Everybody knew each other, and we all lived on farms. And whenever anybody new came into town, we all knew that there was a new person. And they were sized up very quickly. And often the new people would come in because they would want to work on the farm for a while, and long enough in order to accumulate a nest egg or what have you. And it was quite interesting that some of these people were given the boots very quickly. And the explanation from the parents or the friends was always, well, we didn't feel right about him. There was something wrong with him. You couldn't trust him. And of course, in a small village with no RCMP, no nothing, it's a huge cost, as it would be in the ancestral situation. It would be a huge cost to allow into the group somebody who turned out to have a social deficiency of a kind that was dangerous. So I think there are two parts to the story. I think Sam Bowles, although we hate that part of the story because we don't like to think that a major part of who we are is our having our ancestors engage in intergroup lethal competitions, but almost certainly that's part of the story. There's another part of the story that may or may not have to do with trade, and I think another part of it clearly has to do with how we interact with each other in these very subtle ways. Now, I'm going to end quickly with just a point about reasoning. I think one of the things that I'm really deeply puzzled about, and I know many psychologists and neuroscientists are too, and that is, what happened to my slides? Is what reasoning actually is. Now, of course, to a first approximation, we're taught, as we learn everything else, by being given examples of the good instance. This is to reason well. This person allowed heart over head, and see how how they, just ignore that for a moment. And so I really want to understand what it is when we're talking about reason in science. I want to understand what the psychological parameters are, and from the point of view of the brain, what that is. Now, if Rodolfo Linus were here, and I promised I'd imitate him for 3 minutes, he would say, look, and he's taught me so much about how to look at problems in neuroscience, but he would say this, look, don't look at the problem from the perspective of a highly complicated organism like a human playing chess. If you do that, you're going to get totally confused. Remind yourself that nervous systems, that the evolutionary platform for nervous systems is movement. It's not being able to count. It's being able to move in such a way as to survive, to succeed in what Paul MacLean called the 4 Fs: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproduction. And the sensory systems, and later the additions to the sensory systems, are in the pay of behavior. That's the only way you can get the thing to go, evolutionarily speaking. And consequently, when you look at cognition from that perspective, I think it kind of removes the temptation to think that there's emotion on the one hand and that there's reason on the other, and that these are two completely different things. I think in the nether regions, they are kind of different, but I think in between, there's just a real misagosh where you can't really separate it out. And I want to move fairly, if we can, move fairly quickly. Now, because Hume has already brought up, how am I doing on time, actually? Am I just about out? Because I know everybody's starving, so I don't want to go on. All right. Everybody, Hume was brought up earlier, and it was wisely agreed that you can't derive an ought from an is, and you can't read off the oughts from biology, and blah, blah, blah. And although I dearly love Hume, you know, I think what he had in mind is something like this. That a certain practice exists, say infanticide amongst the Inuit, doesn't thereby entail that we ought to do it. All right, fine. However, I think that that's all you can say about it. And the litany that we constantly hear from philosophers about you can't derive an ought from an is, and we, the philosophers, get to do the normative stuff because we're deep and have a very, here Peter Atkins and I are on the same page, alas, whereas the scientists can do what is the case, but we do what ought to be the case. Just crap. Our natures constrain our values and how we refine existing values. I think reasoning about social practices, say infanticide or cannibalism, or whether to treat in expensive burn units, illegal aliens caught in the fire. Reasoning about social practices is probably a constraint satisfaction process, one that we kind of understand in, guess what, the perceptual domain. Just as much of scientific reasoning is not, in any sense, deduction and induction. This is, again, a myth that philosophers like to peddle. It really has to do with inference to a good hypothesis relative to my background beliefs, which is then revisable. Sometimes following Peirce, that gets called abduction. Sometimes following psychologists, it's called case-based reasoning. Practical decision-making, practical reasoning, I think, is no different. We make an inference to the best decision about what we ought to do. We use pattern recognition. We draw on past memory, infused as it is with evaluation, and we make an inference to the best decision. I think from the very earliest stages, and I think this is kind of demonstrably so in the case of nonverbal animals, perceptual categorization is infused with value. It's pretty tough for my grandchildren not to see that and see it as something desirable, as something to be wary of. Poison ivy, they learn, and then I have a visceral reaction to poison ivy. I see it, the pattern recognition is there, but it's not clearly separable, and so forth for other things. So I think how I'm thinking about this, and this may in the fullness of science turn out to be a crock as well, but I think representations, as we're coming to understand them within the context of the reward system and how it gets tuned up, representations usually are valence. That's how they come. And then you have to do this other fancy thing to get rid of it. Separation of fact from value, which we think is so dead obvious, from the point of view of the brain actually requires work. It's like milk, if I may retreat yet again to the farm. So it comes all, the milk and the cream is all part of it, and it takes a fancy device to separate the facts from the values. So I think much of reasoning, and here again, psychologists are really, really doing interesting work on this. Much of reasoning involves pattern recognition, similarity to a prototype, and vector completion. And I'm not going to show that, but I want to show this. So that, just to take a simple example. Actually, I should show you the... Have I got time to show just a couple things? How am I doing, Roger? I'm doing fine, okay. Okay, but there are data. Okay, so vector completion. Okay, can you roll it, or should I be rolling it, or what should I do? Okay, here we go. Next, help, meeting minder. All right, we're not. There we go. Okay, so you're actually getting very little. But the motion, brains, of course, love deltas. Look at the deltas in this. And we vector complete like crazy. And one of the great things that modelers have helped us understand, people in Terry's lab, that I know Jeff Hawkins and other people, is what vector completion looks like in brains and how it's possible for all that spontaneous activity in the brain to create these things. All right. So I'm going to argue that much of what we think of as reasoning is not classically deductive. It's not classically inductive. It's pattern recognition. And it's searching around for the right pattern. Is 9/11 similar to that, Pearl Harbor, or is it more similar to that? And sometimes the pattern recognition has to wait until we get more data. And I think that's kind of what reasoning is too. Sometimes you say, I don't know. Let's find out from Scott Atran what he thinks about the people who perpetrated the horror. And then that gives you a very different pattern to recognize vis-a-vis. Anyway, so the main moral of this story is that I think we've got an awful lot to learn about what reasoning actually is, but that my hunch, and here I think, Ronnie and I are probably in agreement that there's a lot that you can do, both from psychology and neuroscience, to get the real story and what reasoning is. But we've been sold this absolutely bizarre bill of goods that what scientists mostly do is induction. I mean, it's just so amazingly false as a matter of observational fact. That isn't what's going on almost ever. In any case, I think these are really great, fun, interesting issues. I'm not very political, just as I'm not very poetic, but I do think that the brain and all its mysteries is just about the most fun there is. Thanks. Oh.
So, questions. Scott, you had one?
One thing complimentary, one thing affirmative, and the other big question. So you find that with groups like the French Foreign Legion, you can get a Waffen-SS with an Auschwitz survivor is co-common dance, and the way it's done is the people strip down completely naked,
Right.
and they go through a process of shaving, exercising, bonding, swaying, chanting songs, and in the end they look exactly identical. So that's a part of the mirroring
Yeah,
thing.
no, it's really, really interesting. That's why I think dancing is really interesting.
But another bonding mechanism is just displays of submission, baring your throat, bowing, and that you can bring perfect strangers in. But here's my problem. I find this happening all the time, but I also find that the internet, people are bonding precisely because they don't have to face this. They don't have to smell the other person if they're smokers or if they have bad body odor.
Right.
And women can enter chat rooms with mujahideen because they don't even have to show they're women. And they bond as fast and as profoundly as if they meet in real life and they never see each other. So how does that fit into your...
Yeah. Yeah, well, I don't know about that. I guess, I mean, do they bond in the sense that, you know, they share things that are, you know, goods, that they do, yeah. Well, then, you know, I guess oxytocin can be released under unusual circumstances, you know. But I do think that lots of the rituals that we see in small groups, beating drums, dancing, and so forth, have a really, really important role in social bonding. I mean, the people who are at Woodstock dancing and swaying, those people are bonded for life. They do all kinds of things for one another.
So here's there's a hypothesis popped into my head, which is probably wrong, but that piece of evidence suggests that a lot of these signals are actually negative ones. In other words, if someone doesn't mimic you, that's a negative signal.
It's a negative signal,
And if there isn't anybody there to mimic, then there's no negative breaks. And so, so the positive affiliative things which are sharing can then be fulfilled without any of the breaks.
That's a very interesting idea, and we could test that. But certainly odor is, of course, as we all are learning now, because the olfactory system is coming to be studied. Odor plays a really important role in social bonding. And so it isn't just that, you know, you imitate me and smile in the right way. You also kind of got to have the right, you know, smell.
Lee?
Well, yeah, up to a point. Up to a point.
Well, actually, on that point, because Ron talked earlier about this, the gene that the serotonin transporter receptor gene.
Yes.
And I think what was most interesting is that somebody said to him, "Oh, that's nonsense." I mean, there's this whole community out there that wants to deny the role of genes in chemistry, in behavior, and personality. And there was a very interesting paper, I'm not sure how many in this room are aware of it, in a group, it was published in Molecular Psychiatry. It was a group that looked at they used whole genome analysis. They looked at 500,000 spots across the genome, and they found 20 or 30 different points in the genome that are associated with bipolar disorder. Right. But the most interesting thing about that, which is going to cause us really to rethink what mental illness is all about, is that the alleles that lead to bipolar disorder are actually extremely common in the population without the disease. And it's only at a threshold level where you have the predisposition to bipolar, which suggests that, you know, a moderate number of these is actually an advantage. And it's only when you go over. So, you know, that's a very different view. Whatever it is, I guess we don't know yet what it is that the advantage is. I wonder how you would respond to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that's so interesting right now about molecular biology and psychiatric diseases is it isn't going to be at all like finding the disease for Huntington's. Right? It's not at all like that. And so it's going to be a sort of qualitative effect, but sort of a quantitative effect. And what is important, and I know there's neuroscientists here at UCSD and Salk who do this. I mean, it's the interplay between these things. So, yeah, you can have really low dopamine levels, but if it turns out you also have really high serotonin levels, you get through life okay, or vice versa. And so it's not exactly like Mother Nature knows how to make you compensate. I mean, it's just that the other guys didn't come down to quote Morgan Besser yesterday. But it really is that there's different ways. In my in control talk, I make the point there's different ways of being in control, and some of them have to do with this serotonin transporter and that serotonin transporter and this part of the amygdala and so forth.
Well,
and
maybe you could mention Terry Moffat's work at this point, just very briefly.
Yeah. Well, and then of course there's the role of the environment, and as you know only too well, the gene-environment interaction. So in the Terry Moffat, Caspi and blah, 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 Moffat work, it was related to what Ronnie was talking about, and namely that there was an enzyme, monoamine oxidase A, that was missing. There is a variant of monoamine oxidase A transporter gene. And as a result of that, there was a subpopulation of males, because it's carried on the X chromosome, and if you've got two X's, you're going to be okay, carried on the X chromosome. And how this translated into behavior was what we might call these lads were out of control in aggression. And so they would respond very aggressively to almost nothing, but and they were in and out of the criminal justice system. So this was a beautiful longitudinal study of the kind that, you just die for. So they followed this huge group of males from birth until they were well into their 30s. And this subpopulation had both the behavior and they had the genetic variant. But here's the interesting part, was that some had the genetic variant and didn't show the behavior. And it turned out what made the difference was the environment. So if you carried the variant for MAOA and you had an abusive upbringing, the probability of your being, so to speak, a nutter was extremely high. But if you carried the gene and you had a loving upbringing, then the probability was not too much different from the probability of those who didn't have the variant. So it was this really, really interesting example of a very specific gene and a very specific kind of environmental stressor that resulted in the behavior. And then the behavior relates to what Ronnie said, because MAOA regulates serotonin uptake. And of course, we know serotonin's all over the place for all kinds of important things, and if you don't have good amounts of it, then you're hosed. So.
I just want a real quick follow-up to that, which is that, the monoamine oxidase story, it's interesting because it shows a direct effect between gene and behavior. It's an extremely rare mutation, probably has no positive. It knocks out the gene. Okay, it's only in the Netherlands, I think, is where they found it. But
New
okay.
It
But
was New Zealand,
the common diseases like bipolar and schizophrenia may be more like the sickle cell story, where the sickle cell kids are natural selection sacrifice for the advantage of having one allele which provides protection against malaria. And, it says Mother Nature's a nasty bitch, doesn't give a damn about the individuals, throws off the bipolar because there's some advantage of having a lower dose.
People
and we're going to find out what that is.
Schizophrenia as well, because it turns out that there's very different genes involved, whether you belong to the Swedish family who was analyzed, or whether you belong to the Welsh family who was analyzed, or the Icelandic family who was analyzed. And this has prompted people to say, having some variant of some of these genes, like a short promoter in certain places, might actually do you some good. But nobody knows what the answer to that question is at this point. Huh? Won't be long. Yeah. Well, you're the molecular biologist.
Yes, two more questions.
Two sort of interrelated points. One, regarding the bipolar literature, there's actually a longstanding literature that first-degree relatives of bipolar individuals often are quote-unquote, very creative, high-energy, extremely successful individuals. So that's actually been recognized for a long time. And the larger point is that often a little of something is very good and a lot of something is not so good.
Yes.
And actually we see this again and again, and that brings me back to your oxytocin vasopressin story. And I wonder whether anyone has looked at whether there's a vasopressin relationship in men who are obsessive about their women, and or an oxytocin relationship in the women who steal other people's babies, in analogy to the
Yeah,
Rolls-Royce.
no, it's a really, really interesting question. The human work basically hasn't been done, but I just have to tell you, I mean, somebody mentioned Paul Zak. I think it was Michael Shermer. But Paul Zak did this with a bunch of colleagues, this great thing where you get, and I have to tell you that my graduate students in the philosophy department got some oxytocin from the black market in Europe, and they did this too. They did. Philosophers can do experiments, sort of. Anyway, what Paul Zak did in a very controlled fashion, in contrast to my lot, was they got the oxytocin and sprayed it up the nose. Why the nose? Well, because the olfactory bulbs are very handy, and they're the fastest route into the brain. And in the investor game, and if you want to know how that's played, I'll tell you by and by, they did see an increase in trust in the oxytocin group contrasted to the control group. And here's the kicker. So if you got the oxytocin and you're playing the game not with a human, but with a computer, the effect goes away, right? So this is a wonderful example because it turns out that there's other effects, let us call them cognitive for want of a better term, that are playing some sort of role here, such that you play very trustingly if you know it's a human that you're playing with. Cool, cool result. But I think the oxytocin story, we just have the very tiniest fragment of it, and it's just going to get more and more interesting.
One last comment since you've got the mic there, Austin.
Thanks. Austin Dacey with the Center for Inquiry.
Oh, right.
I'm as big a fan as the next guy of serotonin, but as a philosopher who at least dabbles in ethics, I did want to say just a word in defense of moral philosophy. And I think it's important for the general themes of this conference that we discuss this more. In rebutting Hume on the is-ought gap, you said, well, of course you can't just read off normative ethical principles from the genome, but that nature constrains our values, which I agree with. But notice that that in itself, to echo Rebecca earlier today, is not a biological claim. In fact, it's a principle in normative ethics. Kant's principle of ought implies can, perhaps. And we can ask questions about that. What kind of can is it? The principle says if it is the case that you ought to be able to do something, then it must be the case that you're capable of doing it. Well, psychologically capable, with how much effort. And there's a further point. Even if it turned out that the state were impossible for me, it doesn't follow from biology that it's not a proper ideal for me. There are many states, for example, perfect virtue or perfect health, that are impossible for me to attain, yet nevertheless can regulate my behavior in good ways by asymptotically approaching them. I don't know what the answers to those questions are, but all I wanted to say is that no number of prairie voles is going to answer it for us.
Look, I mean, there's obviously normative issues. Should we pay for these illegal aliens who cost $5,000 a day in the burn unit at UCSD? I mean, sure. And consulting my gut actually doesn't tell me very much. And so, although I don't think that reason as it's characterized by philosophers helps very much either. What probably does is exposing yourself to, so to speak, to other points of view, and then somehow the brain, a constraint satisfaction process is put into place, and you come to a decision. I mean, let me just put it in the simplest possible way, which I'll pretend not to believe, but actually do. Francis Crick and I used to talk about morals quite a lot because he thought of it also as a biological phenomenon. And He used to say, look, there's really just two parts to the story. One is the biology, and the other is the politics. And what the politics is a real missagosh. It involves power struggles. It involves particular historical conditions. It involves how you happen to have your reward system tuned up by whoever it was. It depends on whether you go to UCSD philosophy department or the Princeton philosophy department. It depends on all kinds of stuff. And it really does involve, in many instances, negotiation. And we like to think that, no, we're reasoning our way to the right answer. Or else, if you're a certain group of biologists, you like to say, no, it's my gut who is leading me to the right answer. I don't know what it is, but I know it isn't a simple reasoning matter, that it does somehow involve this very complex interpersonal business, and that things like the emergence of a very powerful person make a big difference to what people think is right or not, that particular conditions have a big effect on it, and so forth. So I am deeply skeptical of the idea of the program that dominated philosophy from Kant onwards, which was to find the rule, that rule which had no exceptions, which governed all morally correct behavior. And I mean, I really tried to make that work. And I have to say, at the end of the day, nuts. It isn't like that. And if anybody had anything close to the right story, it was Aristotle, who was under no illusions about the idea that there would be universal rules that would be divined by the normatively skilled. He saw life as kind of a mess, and politics as a business, and you do the best you can, and it sounds boring, but I kind of think that's what the politics part of moral philosophy actually, I mean, if you look at it realistically, I think that's what it is. But I realize most moral philosophers think I'm a complete cretin.
Just a very quick follow-up.
Yes.
I don't think you're a cretin. I agree with you about Kant and the principle, but what you've just made is a point about moral psychology, the way that people actually do reason.
Sure.
But I was raising a question about the relationship between the empirical psychology and the empirical sciences more generally and moral philosophy.
Well, Ronnie D'Souza has famously said in his book, Why Think, that what we value is what we care about. And the facts of the matter are that what we care about is not independent of what our genes programmed us to value. I'm sure that when I met Paul, I had this flood of oxytocin, and we are bound, right? And when I had my children, I mean, it's not like I reasoned about it. I didn't, say, I think I'm going to value this guy because, he's, I don't know. It isn't like that.
Well, I was going to ask Ronnie if he wanted to say something, but he said that he was happy. So I would not,
sure what that
I would
means.
not wish to disturb that eudaimonic state at all. So a great talk, and can we thank Pat for the talk?